Hello, and welcome to Wired for Wellbeing, a podcast devoted to viewing our lives through a nervous system perspective to better understand what's actually going on and how to shift it. Because we are inherently wired for well-being, we all hold the keys to connection, happiness, and ease. Hi, I'm Dr. Jeffrey Rutstein, and in the past 40 years as a clinical psychologist, I've specialized in the treatment of trauma, dissociation, and chronic illness and pain. In this podcast, we listen to real questions and challenges from people just like you and offer guidance, perspective, and a way through. I'm joined by my good friend and producer, Steve Lessard. Hey, Steve, say hi.
Hi, everybody.
Today's episode centers around patterns in the way we get dysregulated, like the pull of compulsive behaviors, and patterns in the way our nervous system holds onto memory. Through our calls today, we'll explore how these loops can keep us stuck or open the door to healing, and what it means to truly update the system. Through this process, you may discover how shifting these patterns can bring greater ease, freedom, and possibility. Steve, what calls do you have for us this week?
Well, Jeffrey, as you mentioned, both our questions this week orbit around patterns. Our first question looks at pattern forming in real time. Let's take a listen to this anonymous question.
Hello. I have a question about nervous system regulation and obsessive compulsive disorder. When my nervous system has gone into hyperarousal and I'm dysregulated for an extended period of time, during that time I'm working on coming back to center, I've noticed lately, and I'm looking into this, that my OCD becomes more intense. So my question is this tendency to check and perseverate during difficult times bringing me closer to center, closer to regulation, or further away? In other words, is it more regulating to resist the OCD or to surrender to it? Thank you.
That's a great question. And I want to also just first reflect that this caller has a good level of self-awareness, that she's able to notice when she's in regulation and when she feels more dysregulated, and she's able to engage in practices or whatever she uses to help her come back more towards center, towards regulation. And then she's also noticing this rising up of OCD. So for people who may not be familiar with that, OCD stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is an issue that many people have aspects of. What we know about it, we used to see it as some kind of a personality issue or weakness. We really see it now, today, in terms of primarily nervous system dysregulation. So if someone is anxious or frightened, if they're in that flight energy, needing to flee and get away, then that's where we see the brain most often begin to lean into obsessive or compulsive types of patterns. And an obsession is a thought that we loop on, like checking the front door. Did I lock it? Did I lock it? Did I lock it? Or did I mail that envelope? Or did I turn off the oven? It can be things like that. Those are obsessions. Compulsions are behaviors that we feel forced, pressured, driven to keep doing to make sure, like a classic example is washing our hands. Someone doesn't feel their hands are washed well enough. And in some folks, this can go to quite an extreme. But for many people who suffer from this at a lower level, a less life hijacking level, it can just be this feeling to keep having to do something, to save papers, or to make sure there's no crumbs out, or to make sure all the windows are locked, or little things that we feel compulsive about doing, meaning that if we don't do it, we'll feel some tension. So whenever any nervous system is in flight, we have more access to this activated energy that will end up driving, looping in our thinking, obsessing, ruminating in our thinking. That's just real common, and people will do that even without having an OCD diagnosis. You'll notice that your brain naturally just can do this. Now, for people who don't have full on OCD, they may find that if they're not in flight, the OCD hardly arises at all, or in much more quiet ways. But there is a direct correlation. To the more dysregulated I get, or you get, the more that these symptoms will appear. And while compulsions are also fairly common, obsessions are even more common in the general population to keep looping on thoughts. So this caller then asks, like, well, how's the best way to relate to this? Should I fight it, or should I go with it and see it as somehow trying to bring me back to center? Well, that really is a great nuance of the question. With OCD, there's not an end to it. In other words, it's not like if you ruminate about it, your brain will go, okay, I've done ruminating about that for 3 hours and I can put it away and rest. OCD is a self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning that the more that I'm looping and ruminating about a thought or feeling compulsive about having to do a particular behavior, the more that I do it, the more I'm going to feel like I need to do it. And what will also arise fairly quickly, the moment that I try not to succumb to uh, uh, a pull to keep thinking and worrying about something or to keep doing a behavior, the moment that I stop that tendency in myself or try to, I actually raise the inner temperature quite quickly. I get more anxious, more uncomfortable, a bit more overwhelmed. And often that can drive people then into finally just succumbing to or accessing their obsession or compulsion and engaging in it just because the resistance to it feels so uncomfortable and anxiety provoking. So, one of the things I would do is first notice that one's OCD symptoms or the tendency to loop and worry and ruminate are only a message. Primarily, they are a message. And the message is that your nervous system is not feeling safe and comfortable and centered then. That's not a fault. That's information that your nervous system is picking up something in you, in the environment, or in somebody else between you and them in the relationship that makes your nervous system feel less safe and less settled. And because of that, it's going to lean more into this habit, this mental habit of ruminating. So, one of the best things we can do is when we notice our uh, thinking and ruminating sort of being shaped by our flight energy, then the most helpful thing we can do in that moment is find a way back towards regulation. And that can be as simple as putting our hand on our heart, just making some friendly contact with the body. Again, the body does not distinguish friendly touch that's offered by someone you care about or friendly touch being offered to yourself. The nervous system responds directly when the body is touched in a friendly and safe manner, and it begins to come back into regulation. Now, we know that OCD is an activation of sympathetic uh, energy or defensive state, which means that it's higher energy. So, any practice that helps lower your arousal level will help you begin to shift out of being dominated by obsessions and compulsions. And so, that could be beginning to lengthen your out breath so that it's about twice as long as your in breath, and making a mental note that you're noticing you're obsessing. In other words, to step out of whatever it is you're obsessing about, because you're in the middle of that story, to step back like you already are and recognizing, oh, this is my mind going into its OCD patterns. So naming and noticing also gives us a little bit more space and regulation. Finally, um, something else for anyone struggling with OCD, there's a book that I've used with clients for many years called Brain Lock. Brain Lock by Jeffrey Schwartz, I think it is. And it's a 4-step program for working with mindfulness um, as a healing tool for OCD. And it gives some real good ways of reframing what's going on in the brain and ways of taking your nervous system from being more and more hijacked to finding something neutral and settling or positive to shift your focus to. So it's a very good program you may want to explore to see if you'd like to find even more relief with the OCD. So Steve, how did this land on you?
What's coming up for me, Jeffrey, is I'm wondering if there's any wisdom or info in like the range of compulsive behaviors. There's one of like, I need to lock the door 3 times. I just do it. I've done it since I'm a child. I do it, whatever. And then there's others that are, if I don't lock the door 3 times, my mom's going to die. I don't know what the range would be, but it does seem like there might be a range in that. So what information exists in individuals asking that type of question?
Well, that's also a really great point to bring up. Thank you for that. There is really a range, right? Like there's a range from, I've worked with children whose hands are raw from washing their hands 30, 50, 60, 70 times a day. Um, it's sad and it's painful, and these children are trapped. They're being driven to do this behavior ceaselessly by their brain. Um, but many, many bright people or people who use their thinking as a way of navigating the world will find that if they get anxious, they'll start to lean into a bit of this. And like I said, most people will lean a little bit into what people notice as rumination or looping. You keep having a similar thought over again. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that doesn't happen. Or I hope we can make this happen. I hope we can make this happen. It could be a worry. It could be an aspiration. The idea is continuing to loop over something as if looping over it helps us get closer to our goal. So somehow I think that if I keep thinking about this, I'm exerting some control over a process that's making me feel more anxious because I feel like I have very little control over it. So from a mental perspective, the OCD can feel like it's a way of keeping things under control. But what we're missing in small or large doses is that it tends to kind of control us during that time. And again, whether it controls you a little bit or a lot determines your own personal sense of suffering and burden that this issue will bring to you. But the good news is, no matter where anyone is on the continuum of OCD, the very first step can be learning how to regulate, because absolutely positively, the nervous system plays a central role in this. There are some people who have such strong OCD, it's being driven by such a brain, possibly a brain imbalance, that there's medication that is needed for them to help find a baseline again, to come back more into regulation. And there's nothing wrong with that. So even with medication, I have a lot of people who also, in addition, practice self-regulation skills because it augments the medicine and reduce sometimes their need to take higher doses or to stay on it quite as long. So did that clear up that?
It did, and I want to invite our friends listening and watching to maybe check out your website for resources on how to regulate, as you brought that up as a tool in there. Jeffrey, effects of trauma on this. Those individuals who've experienced trauma, what's the, is it the same roadmap?
I mean, so here's the thing, right? All human and mammal nervous systems respond to environmental and genetic changes and shifts and emphasize in different ways, right? But if we have trauma, what we know is that trauma will intensify someone's proneness for dysregulation. The more trauma you experience, the more trauma that's not resolved, that still lives in the body, the tendency is you're going to stay more of the time in sympathetic like an activated state, fight or flight, or in that shutdown and collapse state, you'll be more of the time in those kind of defensive states rather than being able to be in the present and feel regulated. So, uh, having a history of trauma does two things. It usually shortens what it takes for us to get launched into some defensive state. Like for someone else, it might take a 10 out of 10 worry to launch them in to starting ruminating. But for someone with a trauma history, it could be just like a 3 or a 4 stressor, and it'll immediately tell their nervous system, this is dangerous. We better get ready to fight or run. So when someone has OCD or has had trauma, um, it is often a way of also, and this is where the psychology can come in, is that I had OCD as a kid. And it was funny. I used to think that I had to wave my mom off when she drove away, or she would die in a fiery crash. And like, I don't know, I was 6, 7, 8 years old at this time, 9 years old. It was getting big. And I had this fear that I knew, like I couldn't tell anyone about it. It felt too embarrassing to tell anybody. But I was so driven to feel like I had to be at the window and waving her off no matter what. And the idea is if I didn't, she clearly would die in a fiery crash, all because of my fault. Not that I had anger issues with my mom, but the idea is that's how my young nervous system was trying to deal with a lot of the anxiety that I already had as a kid and some of the adversity that was going on in the family was making me get stuck in this routine. And then it expanded to if I hit my hand coming in a doorway, my right hand, I had to turn and hit my left hand. I had all these compulsions and obsessions as a kid. And for my own healing, therapy was helpful, but the main thing that really helped me with the OCD the most was learning how to self-regulate, how to um, befriend my nervous system. Primarily, my avenue was yoga and meditation, but it taught me so much about how to begin to come home to the body. And the more that I could do that, the more that my OCD tendencies could be there, but they didn't grab me and pull me as much. So I think that trauma sets us up with a more reactive and hijackable nervous system. But if we're willing to put in the time with a history of trauma or without, most of us can find it easier and easier and easier to spend more and more of our living time in a regulated state where we're in connection with ourselves and others instead of kind of being here in an upper room in my brain worrying about something that while I'm listening to you talk, I'm back here thinking about what I'm worrying about actually. So trauma sort of adds some of the burden and charge to what someone deals with, but it in no way makes it that healing is inaccessible for them. It's just as accessible for all of us.
I want to take what we've been talking about this maybe real time creation of some of these experiences and tie it to what you shared about your childhood memory and go to our next question, which I think starts to look a little bit more at long term memory creation. So, this is a question from Linda. Let's take a listen to Linda's question.
Great.
This is Linda in Hamilton, New York. I just got through taking your nervous system course, and it was wonderful. Thank you. My question has to do with, can you explain more to a lay person about what memory consolidation really means and what you think are the best types of trauma therapies for memory reconsolidation? Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Well, Linda, that's a great question. And there's different layers to it too. So Linda asks about memory consolidation or memory reconsolidation. So let me just take a short detour and talk about each of those terms. So in the neuroscience field, we look at memory consolidation as the path that an event takes place outside of us, comes into the brain, gets encoded in one area for short-term memory, over time gets brief amount of time gets shuttled towards medium-term memory, and then eventually makes its way over to long-term memory. And that's the arc of general memory consolidation, taking an event and it becomes a memory through kind of like 3 fluid phases, moving to different systems, really different geographical areas in the brain that have different functions in the different anatomy parts. So that's memory consolidation. Memory reconsolidation is a theory that is being pursued by some folks in the trauma field. And it's looking at the idea of how can we reconsolidate a memory. And so what they propose is taking a traumatic or charged memory, bringing it up so that the person is feeling somewhat dysregulated. And because of that, from this theory, the idea is that the mind is more pliable. The brain is a little bit more neuroplastic at that time. And you can have new information layered over that memory, or it be seen now from more of an adult perspective instead of child perspective. I personally don't see that is the entire or central role even of trauma therapy, right? So I don't really know what therapies, to get directly to your question, are the best for memory reconsolidation. I'm more interested in what, for more people or most people, helps them on the path to healing. And when I use healing, I mean that very specifically. I'm not talking about cure. I'm talking about healing as from wholeness, the idea of feeling whole again instead of fragmented or ashamed and less than, or like damaged goods. Um, it's the idea of feeling of one piece and having a sense of self-care and kindness towards oneself. That's really some of the most important and fundamental shifts. To be able to have a different relationship to what happened to us. And that does sometimes involve what some people would call memory reconsolidation. But it's, for me, it's actually more about, because it's not just when people recall a memory, they still have a charge, but it's the way that our nervous system reacts throughout our day when we're not in the middle of remembering something. We're in the middle of someone shouting at us for no reason, and we fall into a memory. We fall into being triggered, and our nervous system is all of a sudden standing now in front of a screaming, violent, dangerous adult, and we're feeling young and vulnerable and overwhelmed and underpowered. So to me, it's about noticing when our nervous system gets dysregulated and then being able to find a path back in the storm, to find a path back to a safe shelter, a vantage point where I can still be here with what's going on, but not dragged around by it. And to me, that's even more important than the focus on memory reconsolidation, which has been shown to help somewhat with reducing specific charges on particular memories that are worked on. But I haven't seen the generalizability of the reconsolidation work, how well that spreads to other parts of people's life. So there are probably some therapies you could look up that specifically focus on that. But from the way that I work and my experience over these decades has been that memory reconsolidation is just a part and parcel of the overall process of therapy. It's a part of it. It's not necessarily the central or defining part of it. I hope that offers some clarity to this.
Jeffrey, as you were sharing Linda's questions, I noticed myself trying to jump between the two questions that we had today and trying to find the parallels and the themes. Maybe you could spend a little time and help us understand how these are connected.
Well, I think in several very important ways. One way is that just like for all of us, our anonymous caller and Linda both are sharing that they're aware that their nervous system is driving the bus of their life a lot. With our first caller, it's about how does she relate to this, and is her nervous system pushing the OCD, pushing the problem as a way of trying to lead her to center, to help her get to center by OCDing more? Or is this something that it would be better for her to not just drop into the habit with? And one of the things that I had encouraged our first caller to do is to begin to form another relationship with the OCD. She's already in that vein right now. She's working with it, but to become even more kind to it and see if she can come back into some regulation and also just be aware of the push and the pain, the fear that's often promoting the ruminating and the OCD in the first place. And that's similar to our second caller, Linda, who is wanting to be able to really think about memory reconsolidation and what therapies are best for that. And that's also a way of trying to, this is how it's similar to our first caller, is that it's about forming a relationship to what we call memory, right? Now, in my experience, there's different types of memory. There's explicit and implicit. Explicit memory is the memory I have of, um, I was 6 years old and we went to this ice skating rink and this happened and we got a hot chocolate afterwards. It's an explicit memory. It's recorded. I have a narrative of it. Now, other memories, particularly traumatic memories, sometimes are encoded without words. There's a variety of reasons for this. But these memories we sometimes will call implicit memories. It's actually sort of known in the body much more than the story is known or understood by the head. And an example in the literature was many, many years ago, a vet who had come back from Iraq and on a particular day got out of his car and held up a convenience store and then pointed his pistol at responding police officers. Turns out, though, that this was a day, same date, but 3 or 4 years earlier, when he was during his tour, that most of the guys he was with in an armored carrier were killed and he escaped. And he just felt a super strong urge to die that day. And he hadn't been as suicidal, he'd been depressed. But this is what we would consider an implicit memory, without even being conscious of it being the anniversary date of when his brothers from the service were all killed and he wasn't. He was acting out survivor's guilt and the desire to join them and the desire to erase his shame by living, by being able to finally die. But this wasn't explicit. So he didn't even know what he was doing until he got help after the event. He was just feeling controlled by something. So we all have explicit and implicit memories. And if we've had trauma, we're going to have even more implicit memories than someone who hasn't had trauma, because traumatic experiences themselves frequently overwhelm the capacity to verbalize or understand it even in words. So for both of our callers, they're aware that their own past is playing a very strong and living role in their day-to-day functioning. And that by forming a relationship with our past and with our memories, how they return to us through the body, through feelings, through struggles, through conflicts we get into, through migraine headaches or intestinal issues or lung difficulties. There's lots and lots of ways that stress and conflict and overwhelm show up in the body. And so by forming another relationship with how our nervous system talks to us, instead of being an adversary and trying to shut it up, but beginning to listen to the messages it's constantly sharing with us, we're in much more of an empowered position to work with the nervous system as it is versus trying to wrestle our nervous system to the ground, which will not work.
I think another place for me that that empowerment comes from in my experience is understanding in this polyvagal approach that I can become the witness to something happening that is outside of my awareness or seeming control, and that's opened up a lot of freedom for me for when something happens. I can have a different perspective or approach on why that's occurring. And I think clearly the same thing might be happening here. And it might be helpful to understand, like, aside from keeping us alive, which is our job of our nervous system, what's it trying to do in both of these cases? Like, what is its script that it's running out? Like, are these behaviors trying to keep us safe?
Okay, so I can go back to my example with me because I don't know enough about our anonymous caller's childhood. But, I think that the tendencies for OCD can also be inherited. So my mother was anxious and I was also OCD. So it was modeled in the household. I think being like her, she was the more powerful one in the house, kept me safer. And I was almost always worried as a child. And so that's where my brain naturally went. It wasn't like I tried to make myself think or worry about stuff. It just was happening in spite of me not wanting it to a lot of the times. But somehow, like, for example, this compulsion about waving my mom off as she drove away, otherwise she'd die in a fiery wreck. I say that with a smile because it felt so real and tragic at the time that I had that power. So part of it was probably helping me feel like I was saving my mom's life, maybe also a compensation against my anger at my mom or my resentment towards her. It was sort of bundling that in me instead of telling me, you should tell your mom how angry you are. You should just let her go off and get punished by going into a fiery wreck. I couldn't do that, right? It was too dangerous. I couldn't risk losing her, and I couldn't risk having her rage come at me either way. It was not right it was not going to be safe for me. So I learned very early on how to keep most of my feelings to myself. And the more upset or angry I got, the more I would just start looping and ruminating in my head more and more loudly. So it helps bind some energy and it helps take us away from, we're running around with our fear, right? And when I'm really afraid, I'm not going to be able to be as angry. Like, for me to get really angry, I have to really channel that energy into anger. If I'm also afraid, it'll be sort of modulating or moderating the amount of anger I can access. And I may not even feel safe to show it if I'm already afraid. So I may feel like there's anger, but I'm angry at me instead of angry at you. So, and I think that our memories being dissociated, right? And again, I'm making lots of leaps with Linda's call. And if I'm wrong, Linda, forgive me, please. Many people who've had trauma in their backgrounds and look for memory reconsolidation are living with traumatic memories, either ones they've always had or ones that they have discovered or recovered during the process of their own growth work or therapy. But the idea is that it's what happened to us that keeps driving us and our nervous system years and years and years after the event, even when our heads know better. Even when our heads can say, this is OCD and I don't need to do this right now, the nervous system still pushes us forward. And until we take the charge out of some traumatic memories, they can reinsert themselves, continually intrude into our awareness, into our emotions, crimping our ability to live in the present moment because we're getting dragged back to a painful and often frightening and shaming place. So one of the ways that people survive, especially in any family where there's conflict or where there's feelings that emotions should be suppressed or not expressed by children, or positive emotions can be, but negative can't be, this sets people up to try to survive in those environments, and they end up internalizing their own emotional experience, meaning they don't feel safe or entitled to communicate it. They just have to swallow it and live with it and try to make it go away. And I think that both of our callers are sharing how their past is still driving the bus of their life at times. And what you and I are talking about across the board is, how do we help people get back into the driver's seat? And the first thing is to start seeing the relationship between you and your nervous system, and then to begin to engage in practices or ways that lets you begin to work with the nervous system, to learn how to shift the state back towards regulation instead of just climbing more and more and more in anxiety or anger or worry or looping.
Jeffrey, how can people learn more about this work? How can they leave a message for you to answer? Where do they go?
Thanks. All right. So, first of all, if you'd like to send a question, and I want to thank both of our callers today, our Anonymous and Linda. Really appreciate you taking the time and the effort. It's wonderful because it really lets us dive deeply into juicy material. If you'd like to send a question, feel free to call 866-357-5156. That's 866-357-5156. Or if you're unable to reach that exchange from an international number, you can send an email to hello@drjeffreyrutstein.com. That's hello@drjeffreyrutstein.com. And in that email, you can attach an audio recording, if you're able to, of your question. And if not, you can just send in the written question. And Steve had mentioned some resources on my website. If you go to my website, feel free to type in this address and you can get a video that goes over some of the nervous system basics and a few practices for self-regulation. And that address is drjeffreyrutstein.com/free gift. That's drjeffreyrutstein.com/free gift. And if you enjoyed this or found this helpful, tell a friend. I want to thank you, Steve, as always, for being my partner and my producer in this. It's always fun.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's my pleasure.
Thank you all for joining us today. Hope to see you next time. Bye for now.